Mixing with Mike mixing tip, using analog tape emulations for compression. Um, when we talk about compressors and working with compressors, we mostly talk about working with vintage compressors or working with compressors that are stock plugins that are part of the program, or just sort of the regular plugins that compressor plugins that come with bundles and stuff that every manufacturer has. And one of the beauties of it is that you get a gain reduction meter, controls over the attack and release characteristics, and all kinds of control. And when you get into the vintage stuff, you get optical and tube and all kinds of stuff. But one of the most powerful forms of compression that was used by engineers throughout the history, majority of the history of recording up until probably the late 80s when everything started to transition in recording studios towards digital tape at the time, going into the early 90s, and by late 90s, everything was sort of bleeding into Pro Tools, and then went full bore Pro Tools by the time you get to the 2000s with the Pro Tools HD system. Um, there was something that was lost with all of this and in that transition, and I think it left a lot of engineers feeling empty and confused about what it was. They just would sort of say a generic thing like, oh, analog components sound better, and of course there was a lot of truth to that. But understanding a lot of what was going on, there's a lot of compression going on in the tape realm. And it's not that engineers didn't understand this, but it was a big part of their daily work, how hard you hit the tape. And this is sort of like there's an art form to this, and it's sort of nuts. I actually, in doing tracking sessions, and I used to specialize in a lot of tracking sessions, I would be going 1,000 miles an hour like an octopus, with 8 arms, just kind of adjusting like settings and levels and riding them as I was doing the recording. Kind of keeping everything like at certain levels, because if you record, say, a snare drum and you record it at -10, it will have one sound. If you record it at 0, it'll have a completely different sound. If it hits +3, it'll have a completely different sound from there. One, you're seeing the average level, not the peak level. Two, that bleeds into a lot of different levels of tape compression. The thing about tape compression is that it's not a linear thing. Like when you get a lot of sort of plugins, what ends up happening is that you have a ratio. You say it's 2 to 1, it's 4 to 1, it's 10 to 1. And so whatever amount goes above the threshold, you can predict mathematically what kind of gain reduction you should be getting based on that. When you get into analog components, and when you get into like opto compressors, you get into Varimu compressors, then what starts to happen is, and tape compression, you start to get into the characteristics of the mechanism that you're using to create the compression. And when you start to get into physical components, they have limitations. And when you start to exceed those limitations, then all of a sudden things like ratio and stuff get thrown out. Like you notice with a lot of like, a Fairchild, it doesn't have a ratio control on it. Right, you go in LA2A, it doesn't have a ratio control on it. And if you try to find what those actual ratios are, they'll give you a number, but it's only based on a certain amount of gain reduction or a certain amount of gain going in. Because as you increase that, what happens is you kind of hit a wall. And so what happens with analog tape is very much the same thing. The magnetic particles are resistant to being charged. The more more energy, magnetic field strength that you try to apply to the tape, the more resistant it becomes, because the particles can only handle so much. So it just becomes resistant to the point where you have basically a brick wall limiter. But when you get to the early stages of it, its resistance is minimal. So you're almost running a scale when you bring something in from as your signal is going up, that it goes from like a 1-to-1 ratio essentially with no tape compression. And once you cross that sort of threshold where it starts to be resistant to the amount of field strength that you're applying to it, it increases in ratio the higher that you go up towards the max level. And so there's this thing that goes on. So what's cool about this is that in playing with this, what you get is this sort of variable ratio compression that occurs. And so if you run something through it, what happens is as you start to hit it harder, it will employ different characteristics into the sound, which can sometimes be really, really cool. And it's an incredibly effective form of compression. The problem is that you can't see the actual compression taking place. So, because there's no gain reduction meter. So you have to kind of do it by ear. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just kind of open up some tracks here for a second. And then I'm going to solo up a vocal here. So if I run a vocal track into this, what I have here is just a Kramer tape. So it's just a tape emulation plugin. This is going to be our example here. And the way that I would work with this is from a tonal characteristic, I can set up a tape speed and a bias characteristic. So this gives like an openness to the sound. So if I actually bypass the plugin here.
Slow down, baby, take a moment and breathe. I can't hear what you're saying. Stop for a minute.
And now if I put this in,
Consider with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you. You're scared I might fail you, and so you're leaving here before it goes wrong.
So what you can hear is like a fullness and consistency that kind of pulls into this, which is basically it's compression. What you're doing is you're hitting the tape. Now, if I hit the tape too hard, what happens is the sound begins to just flat out collapse. So in other words, if I actually lock these together and I start driving this higher in gain, so I'm metering the output level here, and I got like a good basic level here. If I start to push this, two things are going to happen. One with this is going to overdrive the tubes that are part of the input stage of this. And the other thing that's going to happen is that it's going to start to hit the tape so hard that the sound is actually going to flatten out. It's going to collapse, right, from too much pressure.
Slow down, baby, take a moment and breathe. I can't hear what you're saying. Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can
right, so it just suffocates the sound, literally.
I don't know what to.
And so part of this is overdriving the tubes. And what you can get with this when you start to overdrive is you get a warming characteristic, but if you push it too far, then it just flattens the sound out. So this idea, like when you work with tape compression, like you just slam everything, is completely wrong. You want to work within the confines and the setup of the tape machine. For this particular plugin, what I found is if you set it to output and you get your gain to like right about 0, you have like a good starting point. Now, where this is really powerful plugin is when you get to the flux control, because if I want less tape compression, I can just basically change the fluxivity level. And what this does is it changes the overall amount of current that's being applied to the head, essentially.
Slow down, baby, take a moment and breathe. I can't hear what you're saying. Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you. You're scared I might fail you, and so you're leaving here.
So this is like, so you can hear the differences here as I start to really crank it up. And there is a little bit of an edge to it, just to the vocal already, just from like running into the tape. But what I can do here, this is basically the way that I crank up the amount of compression that I want with this. So
slow down, baby, take a moment and breathe. I can't hear what you're saying. Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see.
So, and what's really cool about this is as I'm cranking it up, you hear the sound kind of fill out, or it reaches a certain point where you feel the fullness, but you're not overdriving it. And this is like a very, very, very cool way of kind of bringing out the characteristics. So here, if we just listen to...
Slow down, baby, take a moment and breathe. I can't hear what you're saying. Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid.
And this can work with almost any sound. So this is something that, it's like a great way of adding body and presence to a sound. So listen to this in the track. I'll put a little reverb back in on it.
Slow down, baby, take a moment and breathe. I can't hear what you're saying. Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you. You're scared I might fail you, and so you're leaving here before it goes wrong. Don't you know you can?
So what happens here is that the tape is creating like a density to the sound, and because you have this variable sort of ratio thing that happens as a natural byproduct of the medium itself, you get this really, you get this thing that responds dynamically to the input signal that's being fed into it. And whatever signal that you feed into it, you may end up with different settings depending upon how you want to adjust the characteristic. And based on the plugin that you're using, you'll get different effects or different things. If you watch the plugin of the week video that I did on the ATR 102, you get an incredible amount of tonal variation with that used on an individual channel as well. Just a little more CPU intensive on the UA processor front. But you can get some variation. Also, there are several that are quite good. This is good. Also, the Waves J37, the Slate Digital emulations of the Studer tape machine are actually quite good. And they all have different characteristic sounds, so you can get a little bit of a tonal character from each of them. And then it's just a matter of doing it and kind of working with it. Sometimes they don't have a control like this. Most will have some kind of a control, or they'll give you something that says +3, which is 250, +6, which is 370, +9, which is actually 520. And then you kind of go up the scheme here. 185 is like what they would call a standard operating level. This is sort of an under running the opposite direction, creating more of an open sound. So they are represented in different ways because these were calibration systems that were kind of used for working with analog tape. But it's an incredibly effective way to kind of compress or tighten up or pull a sound together. So anyway, this is just a small example of how to use it and a little bit of an understanding and background about it, because I think that's probably the most important thing. So as you use it, you understand what the parameters are, how you're working with them, and how you can kind of get good results with it. And so it involves a little bit of study, a little bit of understanding, and hopefully this tip was helpful with that. So there we have Mixing with Mike tip, using analog tape emulations for compression.